Matthew's portrayal of those goats on the Son of Man's left side, that lot of goats who are cursed and get cast out into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, is a cosmic reenactment of Azazel's punishment that you read about in the book of Enoch. It's not only that, but it's a fulfillment or recapitulation on a cosmic scale of the scapegoat ritual of Leviticus 16. All right, in this episode of Theology in the Underworld, we'll be taking a look at the parable of the sheep and the goats one more time in light of the Day of Atonement and the apocalyptic variations on the Day of Atonement that we see in the Second Temple period, which get associated with that chief fallen angel, Azazel, from the Enochic literature. We're going to look at the imprint of these Yom Kippur traditions on Matthew's parable of the sheep and the goats. The net outcome of this is that Matthew's portrayal of those goats on the Son of Man's left side, that lot of goats who are cursed and get cast out into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, is a cosmic reenactment of Azazel's punishment that you read about in the book of Enoch. It's not only that, but it's a fulfillment or recapitulation on a cosmic scale of the scapegoat ritual of Leviticus 16. In the previous two episodes, we looked at Matthew's use of Son of Man and Azazel traditions in the parable of the sheep and the goats, and also how Azazel's punishment in the Enochic tradition gets tied up with the scapegoat, as you read about in Leviticus 16. So I'd say go watch those two episodes for context if you haven't already. But I want to get the sort of payoff of this episode and this study out in front of us before we dive into the weeds. I published an article on this topic in New Testament Studies. It also shows up as the first chapter in this book as well, about the impact of Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement on the Gospels. So yeah, the final judgment as an eschatological purgation of the cosmos of sin. We're going to look at the impact of Yom Kippur and the Watcher's myth on this gospel parable. But why are we doing this, and what's the theological payoff? Well, in my estimation, if this reading is correct, and let me just say that this isn't like the primary point of the parable of the sheep and the goats, okay? This is not a biblical exposition of the main points. That's not what this video is. We're looking at these Yom Kippur traditions that were floating around during Matthew's day and how they made a subtle influence here. So if what I'm saying is correct, and I think it is, then it's going to give us more insight into how Matthew, the gospel writer, conceives of sin. And why is that important? Well, because one's theology of atonement hinges on one's conception of sin. And what is sin? How does sin have to get dealt with? And if we don't have a solid grasp on that question, well, then we're going to be scrambling and pretty muddy in our explanation of what atonement is and how atonement functions. We'll talk about that at the end of the video once we get through the details. Also, we'll talk about Matthew's theology of atonement and how Jesus' atonement as the goat for Yahweh, as the goat for Azazel, has an impact on biblical theology of atonement. My first book, The New Day of Atonement, Matthean Typology, talks about this at length. So let's lay out 6 tropes that derive from Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, that we see in Matthew's parable of the sheep and the goats. I'm sort of arguing a case here that there are 6 different tropes that stem from the Yom Kippur tradition, from Leviticus 16, and as it gets picked up and developed in the Second Temple period, that you find also in the parable of the sheep and the goats. Okay, so the first one is this Azazel tradition, the fallen watcher, Azazel, and his eschatological punishment. That gets tied up with the Day of Atonement. And the last episode elaborated on that in great detail. The second trope is goats, the goat symbolism, why Matthew uses goats as opposed to any other animal that he could have chosen for the lot of the wicked in the parable. This trope of there being two opposing or juxtaposed groups or lots, okay, that became a Day of Atonement motif stemming from Leviticus 16. We'll get into that. And obviously in Matthew, you have the lot of sheep, right? Or the flock of sheep over here, and then you have the lot of the goats. So we have the two opposing lots or groups. The expulsion of the goats, particularly the scapegoat in Leviticus 16 and the fallen angel Azazel as he gets depicted as an eschatological scapegoat in the Watchers tradition. But in Matthew, we have the goats being cast out, not too dissimilar from the scapegoat in the Day of Atonement. All right, number 5, we have the cursedness of the goats. The scapegoat in Second Temple literature was portrayed as being cursed or bearing a curse upon itself. And as we see in Matthew 25, again, those goats who are cast out into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels, are called what? They're called cursed. And number 6, we have the antithetical destination of the two animals. The goat for Yahweh going up into the Holy of Holies, the most holy and sacred realm, with its blood essentially going into that most sacred realm by means of the high priest, and then the scapegoat being sent away into the wilderness, far away from the sacred realm, even down into the abyss in the Azazel Watchers tradition. And so we have the antithetical destination, the place where, in Matthew's parable, the lot of sheep go into the kingdom of heaven and the lot of goats go into the fiery punishment. All right, so first let's talk about the Azazel traditions that Matthew seems to be aware of and using in his parable of the sheep and the goats. I am not going to go into detail on this because I did that 2 episodes ago, but this is the smoking gun that there is a larger Day of Atonement typology at play in the parable of the sheep and the goats. I'm going to share my screen so that if you are watching, you can see the parallels between 1 Enoch 54 and Matthew 25 verses 31 and 41. It's pretty clear that Matthew is drawing on some Azazel traditions in his portrayal of the devil and his angels, which is the place of fiery punishment where the goats are going to be sent. It's relatively clear that Matthew is pulling on Azazel traditions. Now, this places us squarely in a Day of Atonement frame or frame of reference, because obviously Azazel comes from Leviticus 16, and the goat for Azazel is the scapegoat. Next, let's talk about goat symbolism. So why does Jesus or Matthew choose goats to play the part of the lot of the wicked who are going to be judged? Why not choose a different animal? Is there any negative association of goats in the Old Testament or in Matthew's cultural context? Well, there was a scholar named Kathleen Weber who asked that question and studied the symbolism and the connotation of sheep and goats in the ancient Mediterranean world and in the Old Testament. And she published an article back in 1997 in Catholic Biblical Quarterly, and her conclusion was that there was very, very little in Matthew's cultural milieu that would suggest a negative attitude toward goats. This would have been a complete and total surprise that the lot of the wicked would be cast as goats. I mean, in the Old Testament, you have goats being utilized all the time in temple sacrifices, like other animals, sheep and rams. For example, you have goats being sacrificed all the time, and in the Old Testament, there is no case where goats are given a negative attribution except for one. And so I'm going to read from her article here. She says that the author of the Gospel, according to Matthew, expects his audience to have a basically positive attitude toward goats, which will make the absolute condemnation of the goats in Matthew 25 surprising. And then she says, quote, "The scapegoat that carries the sins of the people off into the desert in the ritual of the Day of Atonement stands as a single negative exception that does not seem to have affected the consistently positive value accorded to goats in Old Testament poetic usage." So to summarize, when you read the Old Testament, there's only one place where goats have a negative connotation, where a goat has a negative connotation, namely the goat for Azazel, the scapegoat. So this is a curious fact that again points us in the direction of a Day of Atonement typology in the parable of the sheep and the goats. Now that begs the question, what about the terminology of the goats? Because if there is a Day of Atonement typology at play, wouldn't we expect there to be a parallel in Matthew's choice of terms? I'll share my screen here once again. Matthew uses the term eriphos for the word goat. Now, eriphos, this Greek term, actually means young goat. And when you look at Leviticus 16, the Hebrew term sa'ir means adult goat, all right? It's a male adult goat that was used in the ritual of the Day of Atonement. Now, the Septuagint translates that term sa'ir as chimeros, which also means an adult male goat. So we have an inconsistency between the term Matthew uses and the term in Leviticus 16. However, what's interesting is that Josephus, 1st century AD Jewish historian, actually uses the term eriphos in reference to the goats of Yom Kippur. So according to Josephus, those goats in the ritual of the Day of Atonement were actually young goats. He uses the term eriphos. What's furthermore interesting is that the Book of Jubilees affirms that the Yom Kippur goats were actually young goats or kids as well, because the Book of Jubilees ties the Day of Atonement to that passage in Genesis 37 where Joseph's brothers, when they betray Joseph and send him away to Egypt, they slaughter a goat, and there it's a young goat, an eriphos in the Septuagintal version in Genesis 37, verse 31, and they dip Joseph's tunic in the blood of that young goat and present it to their father Jacob. And this is the etiology. It's actually the second etiology of the Day of Atonement in the Book of Jubilees. So here again we have a young goat being associated with the goats of Yom Kippur, in addition to that reference from Josephus. Now there's actually a third term. So we have chimeros from Leviticus 16, the Septuagint. We have eriphos in Josephus, but then we get the term tragos, so a third term for the goats that were used on the Day of Atonement in 3 first century sources: Philo, Hebrews, the book of Hebrews in our New Testament, and then the Epistle of Barnabas. What this tells us is that there's actually no technical term for the goats of Yom Kippur. In Matthew's day and age, there were at least 3 different terms at play, and he chooses eriphos. Okay, so that is not an objection that is going to be a deal breaker for this Yom Kippur typology. Now let's move on to the motif of 2 opposing lots, okay? Because we have the sheep on the Son of Man's right hand, okay, on his right-hand side. And then we have the goats on his left-hand side. If you take a look at the gospel text, it reads, verse 33, Matthew 25:33, "And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, then he will say to those on his left," verse 41. We have 2 different groups, and they're in opposition to one another. Now in Leviticus 16, you have lots being cast over the 2 goats. One lot for the Lord and the other lot for Azazel. That's Leviticus 16, verse 8. Now this lot imagery gets elaborated upon and bears some symbolic significance throughout Jewish tradition. In the Mishnah, you have this casting of lots ceremony described in a little bit more detail. And it's possible that this dates back to the Second Temple period, because the Mishnah, written around 200 AD, yes, it's early rabbinic literature. It's post New Testament writings. However, it does contain traditions that date back to older periods. And here in the Mishnah, we have a description of this casting of lots ceremony. What's interesting is that this casting of lots ceremony of the high priest becomes symbolically associated with the right hand and the left hand of the high priest. So again, I'll share my screen here. He took the casket and took up the two lots. On one was written, "For the Lord," and on the other was written, "For Azazel." The prefect was on his right. Okay, that's on the right side of the high priest. And the chief of the father's house was on his left. All right, so let me pause here and just explain that there are two priestly associates who are going to help the high priest cast lots. Okay, they're involved in this ritual procedure. One's on his left-hand side and one's on his right-hand side. Okay, let me continue. If the lot bearing the name, that is the name of Yahweh, came up in his right hand, the prefect would say to him, "My Lord High Priest, raise thy right hand." And if it came up in his left hand, the chief of the father's house would say to him, "My Lord High Priest, raise thy left hand." So we have this casting of lots ceremony being described. When they cast the lots, you basically imagine a casket with a couple like tablets inside or some sort of object where they would write "For Yahweh" and "For Azazel," and they're going to shake it up, and then they would take the lots and place them in the high priest's hands, and whatever hand in which the goat for Yahweh was, they would have the high priest, raise that hand. Now, what's interesting is that in the Babylonian Talmud, we have the right hand or the right side of the high priest, the right hand of the high priest being associated with the goat for Yahweh. All right, this is reminiscent of the sheep on the right side of the Son of Man in the parable of the sheep and the goats. This text, Babylonian Talmud Yoma, it reads as follows. Our rabbis taught throughout the 40 years that Simeon the righteous ministered, the lot for Yahweh or the lot for the Lord would always come up in the right hand. And from that time on, it would come up now in the right hand, now in the left. And during the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the lot for Yahweh did not come up in the right hand. What they're describing here is this high priest Simeon the righteous, a renowned high priest back in the Second Temple period, when he would cast lots on the Day of Atonement. What they're saying is that for 40 years straight, the lot for Yahweh would come up in his right hand. And then fast forward to 40 years before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, according to this tradition, the lot for Yahweh would only come up in his left hand. That was a portent that the temple would be destroyed. So in other words, you have the right hand of the high priest associated with the lot for Yahweh, right? The lot for the Lord, which again is reminiscent of the parable of the sheep and the goats, where the sheep are associated with the right hand of the king or the Son of Man in the parable. And on the left side is the lot of the wicked. Now, this opposing lot imagery is found in earlier texts. For example, from Qumran, 11Q Melchizedek. This is a sectarian text from the Dead Sea Scrolls that describe the final judgment. And guess what day the final judgment happens on? It's the Day of Atonement in 11Q Melchizedek. And on this Day of Atonement, this cosmic day of purgation, the lot of Melchizedek will conquer, will prevail over the lot of Belial. That's the chief angelic antagonist figure in the Qumran scrolls. So that's like Azazel or like the devil, will prevail over the lot of Belial and Belial's spirits. So let me quote from the text. The Day of Atonement is the end of the 10th Jubilee, in which atonement shall be made for all the sons of light and for the men of the lot of Melchizedek. Now that term, goral, is the same term for lot that you find in the Hebrew Bible in Leviticus 16. All right, this is the time for the year of grace of Melchizedek, and of his armies, the nation of the holy ones of God, of the rule of judgment, as it is written about in the songs of David, who said, God will stand in the assembly of God in the midst of the gods he judges. Okay, that's Psalm 82. We talked about this a little bit in the previous episode. Its interpretation concerns Belial and the spirits of his lot, who rebelled by turning away from the precepts of God, becoming utterly wicked. But Melchizedek will carry out the vengeance of God's judgments, and on that day he will free them from the hand of Belial and from the hand of all the spirits of his lot. What's fascinating here is that we have lot imagery, two opposing lots, the lot of Melchizedek and the lot of Belial. The lot of Belial and his spirits. That sounds a lot like the devil and his angels, or Azazel and his host from the parables of Enoch. But you have two opposing lots who are at odds, the lot of the righteous, right, the lot of Melchizedek, and then the lot of the wicked, which is the lot of Belial from the Qumran sect's perspective. And when is the lot of Belial going to be judged? And when will the lot of Melchizedek prevail, the lot of the righteous? On an eschatological Yom Kippur. So this lot imagery, which derives from Leviticus 16, the two lots for the two goats of Yom Kippur, bears some significance here in Matthew's milieu. And the fact that we have two lots in the parable of the sheep and the goats, the lot of the sheep and the lot of the goats, even though that term lot is not used, conceptually, there is a parallel here. Next, let's talk about the expulsion of the goats. This one is relatively straightforward because in Leviticus 16, the scapegoat is expunged or cast out of the sanctuary and the city. Leviticus 16:22 states, "The goat shall bear all their iniquity to a remote area, and he shall release the goat into the wilderness." In 1 Enoch 10, the punishment of Azazel is described. The angel Raphael is told to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. Throw him there. He will be led away to the burning conflagration. So we have an expulsion of Azazel, that chief fallen watcher, just like we had the expulsion of the scapegoat in Leviticus 16. In 1 Enoch 54, now in the parables of Enoch, Azazel is going to be thrown into the abyss. Reading from chapter 54, verse 5, "These chains are being prepared for the host of Azazel, that they might take them and throw them into the abyss. Throw them on that day into the burning furnace." All right, I'm jumping around a little bit in the text there, but the point is that we have the expulsion of the scapegoat, whether it be the actual temple scapegoat or the cosmic eschatological scapegoat embodied in that figure Azazel from the Watcher's tradition. In Matthew 25, verse 41, those goats on his left-hand side, the Son of Man speaks to, I'll just read the text, "Then the Son of Man, or he, will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me.'" In other words, go away. "You who are accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." So the goats here in the parable of the sheep and the goats are cast out, just like the scapegoat and Azazel get cast out in the Watcher's tradition. Now the cursedness of the goats, again, relatively straightforward, but the scapegoat, although the scapegoat is not called cursed in Leviticus 16, it becomes known as a cursed animal, bearing curses upon itself. And we have this terminology in the gospel text in Matthew 25:41. "Depart from me, you who are cursed, hoi katera menoi, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." What's interesting is that we have terminology of cursedness applied to the scapegoat in subsequent Jewish literature. In the Epistle of Barnabas, the author actually quotes earlier halakhic Jewish writings that date back to the Second Temple period. So in chapter 7 of the Epistle of Barnabas, "Pay attention to what he commands." Now he quotes the Jewish source. Take 2 fine goats who are alike and offer them as a sacrifice, and let the priest take one of them as a whole burnt offering for sins. But what will they do with the other? Again, Barnabas quotes the Jewish source. The other, he says, is cursed. So what does this mean? Continues Barnabas. Pay attention. Again, quoting his Jewish source, the one they take to the author, but the other is cursed, and the one that is cursed is crowned. Barnabas is drawing a Christological typology between the goat for Azazel and Jesus, but he's doing that typology using Second Temple Jewish traditions. He's not pulling directly from Leviticus 16. He's drawing this Christological typology between Christ and the temple ritual as it was actually performed in the Second Temple period. And Barnabas, quoting this Jewish halakhic tradition, makes reference to the fact that the scapegoat is cursed. The term he uses is epikataraton. It's the same root word that Matthew uses. Again, we have Philo and his special laws. He also refers to the scapegoat, this time as bearing curses upon itself. So I'll read from Philo. And the other goat God ordered to be sent forth alive into a trackless and desolate wilderness, bearing on itself the curses for those who have erred. Fast forwarding here. For this is the reason the lawgiver has named it the scapegoat, because it is sent away bearing the curses which have been pronounced upon the people. Here, Philo uses a term that is related to the term that Matthew uses in Matthew 25, verse 41. All right, so next we have the antithetical destination of the animals. In the parable of the sheep and the goats, the sheep are to inherit the kingdom prepared for them from the foundation of the world. They are destined for the kingdom of God. The goats, on the other hand, are sent into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And the very final verse, 46, reads, "And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." So we have a juxtaposed destination or destiny of the 2 lots of animals, the sheep going to eternal life, the goats going to eternal punishment. Now let me read from Stekel Ben Ezra where he talks about this trope. He says, quote, "This temple ritual of the 2 goats consisted of 2 antagonistic movements. As the first movement, the holiest person, the high priest, entered the most sacred place, the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple. As a second movement, the scapegoat burdened with the sins of the people was sent with an escort to the desert." So Stekel Ben Ezra is describing the movement of the 2 goats, the blood of the goat for Yahweh entering into the sacred realm, into the Holy of Holies by this holy mediator, the high priest, whereas this cursed scapegoat is getting cast out, burdened with Israel's sins, into the wilderness, which is also associated with the underworld. Now, in the apocalyptic variations of the Day of Atonement, this happens as well. Enoch, in 1 Enoch chapter 14, will ascend into the heavenly sanctuary and behold God on his throne in the heavens, in sort of the cosmic Holy of Holies. Whereas Azazel and his host, the other fallen angels, are going to get cast into a fiery abyss down in the underworld. So in the Book of Watchers, you have this diametrically opposed movement of 2 figures, the sort of priestly figure, Enoch, who's going to go ascend into heaven and actually intercede on behalf of the fallen watchers in 1 Enoch chapters 14 and 15. But then these angelic antagonists associated with Yom Kippur, Azazel chiefly, getting cast downward into the fiery abyss. Once again, the Epistle of Barnabas, the one they take to the altar, but the other is cursed. Here is a stark juxtaposition, and not just juxtaposition, but destination, where one is going up to the altar and the other one is going out into the wilderness bearing curses upon itself. All right, so let's summarize everything we've been talking about. There are 6 Yom Kippur tropes in the parable of the sheep and the goats. The first one being Azazel traditions that derive from the parables of Enoch. Now, this is the smoking gun that tips us off to other Day of Atonement motifs. the choice of goat symbolism as opposed to any other animal, and the negative association given the lot of goats in Matthew's parable, likely deriving from the negative association of the scapegoat, which stands as the sole example of a negative connotation given to goats in the Old Testament. This notion of two opposing lots, the lot for Yahweh and the lot for Azazel that you see in Leviticus 16, gets taken up and elaborated upon subsequently by other Jewish writers. And here in Matthew, we have two lots that are opposed, the lot of sheep and the lot of goats. The goats will experience an expulsion, a casting into a demonic domain, far away from the divine presence, just like the scapegoat was, and Azazel was in the Watcher's tradition. And the cursedness of the goats. In Matthew 25, the lot of goats, they are called you who are cursed. Recall that the scapegoat was thought to bear curses upon itself in Jewish traditions. And then finally, we talked about the two lots. Well, these lots not only were opposed in terms of their valuation, one negative, one positive, but they actually had two separate destinations. One into the holy domain, the sacred domain, towards Yahweh, towards God, namely the goat for Yahweh, and then one into the abyss, into the underworld, into the nether regions of the earth, the cosmic wilderness, as it were. And in the parable of the sheep and the goats, we have the same thing. We have the sheep going into the kingdom of heaven and the goats going into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. So in my estimation, I think there is a Day of Atonement theme, we might say, or typology, we might say, at play in the parable of the sheep and the goats. Now, let me just state for the record that I don't think the main point of the parable of the sheep and the goats is the Day of Atonement or Azazel or the Watcher's tradition. This is just a secondary aspect of the text that has been understudied and under-recognized, and I'm trying to bring attention to it because it has some really interesting theological ramifications. I think the point of the parable of the sheep and the goats is that there will be a final judgment, and the criteria of that judgment is described in detail in the parts of the text that we didn't spend time on or focus on, which has to do with the treatment of the least of these, my brothers. Or really, that's the point of the parable of the sheep and the goats. Yet you have this interesting symbolism that invites intrigue, and it invites the reader to ask questions. But let's just talk about the theological payoff of this study in a little more detail. I mentioned this briefly at the beginning of the video. Matthew's conception of sin, it's going to have an influence on his conception of Jesus's atonement in his gospel. And I want to read from my book, Goat for Yahweh, Goat for Azazel. Okay, so Matthew's prevailing concept of sin in the first gospel is sin as an object in need of physical removal or elimination. Now, let me just pause there. This is very similar to the priestly theology's conception of sin. I talked a little bit about this in the previous episode where we dived into Leviticus 16 and sort of the physics of sin and the temple theology and atonement theology. But there in Leviticus 16, sin has a physical quality to it. It actually adheres to objects. It needs to be removed or expunged from the sanctuary and from amongst the people, and that's what the ritual of the two goats accomplishes. Matthew employs this notion primarily in eschatological contexts. John the Baptist proclaims, quote, "Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." That's Matthew 3:10. Disciples who lose their saltiness are, quote, "thrown out and trampled underfoot." Matthew 5:13. The right eye or hand that causes one to sin should be, quote, "torn out and thrown away." Matthew 5:29 and 30. They are commanded to, quote, "remove the log," that's like a major sin, "from their eyes before they, quote, remove the speck from their neighbor's eyes." Matthew 7:3-5. The unfruitful tree is, quote, "cut down and thrown into the fire." Matthew 7:19. Evildoers are told, quote, I never knew you, go away from me, Matthew 7:23. The weeds sown in the field are, quote, collected and bound in bundles to be burned, Matthew 13:30. The Son of Man will gather all scandala, that is, scandals or causes of sin, and workers of lawlessness, and, quote, cast them into a fiery furnace, Matthew 13:41-42. The eschatological harvestmen, quote, throw out the bad fish, quote, into the furnace of fire, Matthew 13:48 and 50. Every plant that the Heavenly Father has not planted, quote, will be uprooted, Matthew 15:13. When Satan becomes a scandalon, or a cause of sin to Jesus, he is told to depart, Matthew 16:23. Those who scandalize young disciples would justly be, quote, drowned in the depths of the sea, Matthew 18:6. Jesus himself is conceived as a scandalon or a cause for sin, that's Matthew 11:6 and 13:37, to be discarded as, quote, the stones that the builders rejected and tossed away. That's Matthew 21:42. The man dressed in garments of unrighteousness at the wedding feast is bound and, quote, hurled into the outer darkness, Matthew 22:13. Noah's wicked generation is, quote, swept away by the flood, Matthew 24:39. The unfaithful steward is, quote, cut in pieces and placed with the hypocrites, Matthew 24:51. And finally, the lot of unrighteous goats are told, quote, depart from me into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels, Matthew 25:41. What's interesting is that you have instance after instance after instance of sin and impurity, either abstractly or embodied in sinners, in the Gospel of Matthew being physically removed and separated, cast away, expunged in the depths of the sea, into the fiery abyss, being cast away from God or from Christ. This is a consistent theme in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's often in eschatological contexts where you have this notion of sin as an object in need of removal. It needs to be removed from the divine realm. Well, what does that remind you of? It reminds you of the theology of Leviticus. And Leviticus 16, the scapegoat ritual, is the most iconic example of that happening, where the sins of Israel physically get placed on the head of the scapegoat as it gets banished to bear those sins into the wilderness. It's just not Leviticus 16, but it's how Leviticus 16 and the figure of Azazel get picked up and absorbed into the Enochic tradition, and how that chief angelic antagonist, Azazel, gets cast as a cosmic scapegoat in an eschatological context. And this is where Matthew is pulling on both the biblical text of Leviticus 16, but then as it gets sort of read and interpreted in his day and age among various Jewish groups. So Matthew's conception of sin as this physical object in need of removal or expulsion or expiation or purgation is what I think the core concept of sin in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, what that means is that Matthew's theology of atonement, I think, has a corresponding element of needing to carry away that sin or expiate that sin from the presence of God, right? Because God can't tolerate impurity and the compounding of sin in the sanctuary and amidst his people. I've written about that in my dissertation published in my first book, The New Day of Atonement, a Matthean typology. But in my estimation, Matthew portrays Jesus as both the goat for Yahweh and the goat for Azazel. What this means is that Jesus' atoning death is expiatory. It will purge sins from the presence of Yahweh and from amidst his followers and believers so that God can be with his people. Jesus is given the name Emmanuel in the Gospel of Matthew, which means God with us. So Jesus' death as the goat for Yahweh accomplishes this, and as the scapegoat in the Passion narrative, particularly in the Roman abuse scene where Matthew chooses to have Jesus clothed with a scarlet garment, which the scapegoat wore on its head, a scarlet ribbon in Second Temple traditions, which symbolized the sins being placed upon the scapegoat. So I'm not going to get into all of this detail here now, but I think that Matthew has Jesus physically removing those sins away from the divine realm, and that when you have Jesus dying and the temple veil splitting in half in Matthew, but also the earth or the rocks splitting in half, the same Greek term there, schizo, you have an allusion to the goat for Yahweh and the goat for Azazel. The blood of the goat for Yahweh entering into the Holy of Holies beyond the veil, which only the high priest could do once a year, and then the scapegoat descending into the realm of the dead, physically bearing the sins in his descent to the underworld on Holy Saturday. And there are several reasons to think that Matthew understands Jesus to be descending to the underworld. It actually has to do with the sign of Jonah as well, which, again, not going to get into on this video. And one final word about the parable of the sheep and the goats. I mean, we have to step back here and kind of imagine what's happening. We have a cosmic reenactment of the Day of Atonement happening at the final judgment, when the Son of Man comes on the throne in all of his glory with his angels and renders a final verdict of judgment on all the nations. It's going to be like the Day of Atonement, that lot of wicked, and they're going to be going into the fire prepared for the devil and his angels, which is the same place of punishment where Azazel and the fallen watchers were bound and imprisoned. This is a eschatological and cosmic final enactment of the Day of Atonement. The cosmos will be purged. There will be expiation made. Sin and the wicked will be physically removed from the sacred realm when the Son of Man returns to remake the heavens and the earth. All right, that's it for this episode. We covered a lot. Thanks for sticking with me. You can find me on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts, anywhere where you listen to podcasts as well. I'll have some more content coming your way shortly. Appreciate you. See you on the next one. God bless.